from Sports Goofs. This is just an SG mini as well. I'm on the road again, and I'm just wanting to talk about game 162 for the Major League Baseball season 2025. Might do this again later on when I get to my hotel, but it was interesting to say the least for this game, as there were many playoff scenarios that had not been settled just yet. Now, in the run up to all of this, you had the entire month of September, and you had a bunch of baseball teams that were in it and then found themselves surprisingly in it, and, well, disappointingly out of it by the end of this season today. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happened at the beginning of September. So, beginning of September of this month, so baseball, you had all these wild card races and division races. For the most part, I think pretty much every team didn't have it completely settled, save for the Milwaukee Brewers. Milwaukee Brewers have been steadily winning games throughout the entire season and never really let up in regards to letting the Chicago Cubs catch up to them. Everybody else in the National League Central Division seemed like they were out of it for the most part. The Pirates are awful, and the St. Louis Cardinals were pretty mediocre to at best, right? The Cardinals, as far as their performance was concerned, just did enough to just barely stay below 500, but not enough to make you scared of them. So, struggling season for them. The fans showed it in St. Louis. Best fans of baseball didn't show up when the team was not doing well. So, and yes, you can say, oh, they deserve it after supporting them for so long. But at the same time, I'm sure a lot of those National League Central teams were poking fun at the best fans in baseball, as they are just like everybody else, and abandon their team as soon as bad things start happening. But going on that, yes, the Milwaukee Brewers seem to have steadily taken away that division for the most part this season. The Chicago Cubs also bad enough or never slid far enough down to as a wild card team, um, and so they came into this as okay, that's fine. Now, also entering into September, gosh darn, I can't speak. Entering into September, the 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 American League East had the Toronto Blue Jays, who had kind of zoomed past everybody in that division and just held firm in first place. It it seemed like they were going to just keep that spot, but very strong months from the New York Yankees, who at one point were struggling. They had gotten swept by the Marlins in August, and then after that, they turned it around. Actually, after the trade deadline, after getting swept by the Marlins, they turned it around and they were able to give it a ride, because it took until now, game 162 for the American League East, to be settled. The Yankees and the Blue Jays both tied at the same record, but because there's no game 163 anymore, there's no tiebreaker games anymore. It means that the Blue Jays had won the season series and took the American League East, leaving the Yankees settled as the first wild card in the American League. Now, going on with the East as well, the Boston Red Sox were able to get their act together. They traded off Rafael Devers, and it seemed to have fixed all of their problems. They seem to have slid back and forth between them and jostling with the Yankees, never really catching up to Toronto. But after the Yankees, kind of settled things with the Red Sox, they took off, and the Red Sox just kind of held firm and clinched their wild card spot about a couple days ago now, actually. So they did it. So that was, 2 days ago now. That's when the Boston Red Sox clinched their spot and went from there. Going on with the American League West, because the Central Division is where it gets wild, but the American League West, well, there was few teams jostling for those spots as well. It was the Seattle Mariners, the Houston Astros, and the Texas Rangers. The Angels were out of it a long time ago, as well as the Sacramento A's. And well, it seemed like it was going to be another one of those years where the Astros would turn it on and then they just take the division and just leave the scraps as far as wild cards is concerned to either the Rangers or the Mariners. Not the case. The Seattle Mariners had an incredibly strong September on the back of the big dumper, actually on the big dumper of the big dumper, Kyle Raleigh and his 60 home runs. And the Yanks, the Mariners, they clinched the American League West for the first time since 2001. So the Mariners won the West, leaving the scraps for the two Texas teams, and it seemed like that one of those teams was going to take the other wild card spot, and it was probably thought to have been the Houston Astros because they went head to head against the Texas Rangers and took them to town. And the Texas Rangers took on the Marlins, and the Marlins were the Grim Reapers of baseball this year, as the Marlins essentially eliminated the Texas Rangers after a series sweep in Arlington. Going on from there, the Rangers were out, and so the Astros were left to fend for themselves, trying to get that final wild card spot. And well, it came down to them and the two teams in the American League Central. And if you walked into September, you would have thought, yeah, the Detroit Tigers, who seem to have run away with the Central Division at the beginning of this month, would have easily won that division. Okay, the Astros would just slide in there as the final wild card. But lo and behold, the Detroit Tigers completely fell apart in the month of September. Just completely just pooped the bed. It's just gone. Like, it's just gone. And the Cleveland Guardians, with an insane 10-game winning streak and an insane September, tied the Detroit Tigers in the division. They actually went head-to-head against the Tigers and actually took the division lead. Heading into the final weekend of the season, the Tigers take on the Boston Red Sox out in Detroit, actually in Boston, actually, when the Guardians were at home taking on the Texas Rangers. And over the course of this, with one game left to go, actually 2 games left to go, yesterday, the Houston Astros couldn't win enough to keep their season alive. The Detroit Tigers, after losing to the Red Sox in Game 1 of their final 3-game series, won Game 2 and clinched their spot in the postseason, as well as the Cleveland Guardians, who clinched their spot in the postseason on a walk-off hit by pitch with bases loaded in the 9th inning. So, going on from there, you have the final game of the season. You still have the American League Central up for grabs. And both teams won today, but the Cleveland Guardians, because of their head-to-head matchups against the Tigers this month, keep the division for the second straight season. Of course, Cleveland went to the American League Championship last year, so that's still a good ball club. They just turned it on at the right time and came into the postseason hot. and they took the Central Division. Going on from there, the Tigers would slot in as the wild card, but it is not over just yet. So the American League bracket looks like this. The Toronto Blue Jays will have a bye, so they will not be playing in the wild card round, as well as the Seattle Mariners, who also have a bye. The New York Yankees will take on the Boston Red Sox at Yankee Stadium. Now, for those listening to the show, our good buddy Charles here is, oh boy, this is going to be quite a series. All right, Charles has been having a rough year. He doesn't believe in the Miami Hurricanes, Mario Cristobal at the helm, despite their hot start. Wrestling has just been a bit difficult for him to follow, given some circumstances. He watches and he likes the Panthers, but he's not really a Panthers fan. The Miami Heat cause him disappointment because Mickey just won't do the things, and Cotton's getting old and a bunch of other stuff. And well, his Tennessee Titans are just ass, according to Cam Ward. So the Yanks, with Aaron Boone, the bane of Charles' existence right now, heading into hosting a 3-game series against the Boston Red Sox. Major League Baseball loves it. I'm sure they would have loved it if these teams were deeper into the playoffs, but they're going to get this to open up the playoffs, and that's going to be good for ratings for the wild card round. Charles has been riding hard for Aaron Judge for MVP over Cal Raleigh. Raleigh with 60 home runs as a catcher, and Aaron Judge with pretty much every other stat that makes him a little bit superior over Cal Raleigh. We'll see what happens there. And yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be an interesting time to see with the studio. But it's fine. We'll figure it out. Other side of the American League bracket is the Central Division, because the Guardians and the Tigers both fought for that division, and Cleveland ultimately won to just host the Tigers again for a 3-game series in Cleveland. So the de facto, it might as well have been a tiebreaker. It's a de facto tiebreaker at this point. Both teams are tied. Cleveland just hosts the game. So they're just going to have a 3-game series to see who the true American League Central Division winner is. And then I think the way baseball has it, I don't think they reseed for the division series. So at this point, if the winner of the Yanks and Red Sox series will head to Toronto and see who the true winner of the American League East is, where the winner of the Central Division essentially will take on the West Division champion Seattle Mariners. So that is the American League. Moving on to the National League, as I had said before, the Milwaukee Brewers kind of had their stuff settled, and then the Chicago Cubs slotted in as the first wild card from there. After that, you had some, typical of the last few seasons. The Los Angeles Dodgers, superior over the San Diego Padres. They were able to go, they went head-to-head against each other in this month as well, but ultimately the Dodgers pulled ahead enough to win the National League West. The Padres slotted in as, well, the second wild card, and they will go to Chicago to face the Cubs at Wrigley. Going on from there, you had, oh boy, the National League East. The National League East had the New York Mets and the Philadelphia Phillies, and these teams, of course, went head-to-head against each other in this final month. And man, it seemed like it was going to go. It could have came down to the final weekend of the series for that, but it didn't because well, the Phillies pulled ahead. They just kept staying hard, just kept staying, just mashing. That team just mashes, and they've just got this feel about them. And they took it. They took the National League East, and they ran away with it. So the Phillies slotted in as the National League East division winner. So you have the Central Division, the West, and the East already locked up. The first wild card, the second wild card, the final wild card spot. That's where things got interesting because the New York Mets, who at one point in the season were about like 20 games above 500, had completely fallen apart in the second half of the season and lost the division lead to the point where the Phillies just started running with it and they could no longer look at that as an option. Then everything else just kept slipping away as the Cubs and the Padres just kept ticking and locked up their spots there. And they were left to contend with the middle of the National League. The San Francisco Giants got hot at one point and were about a game behind, but fell short or so to try as they just couldn't keep it up with that last week of the season. And they gave it a ride. The Arizona Diamondbacks as well got hot at one point, and they were right behind as the New York Mets were just clinging for dear life to that final wild card spot. And at one point, it seemed like Arizona was going to overtake them, but they just never could get it together enough to get past them. So they were done. The St. Louis Cardinals somehow lingered around. So I don't know how that even happened. I'm sure they don't even know how that happened. But sure, the Marlins had an 8-game or so winning streak somewhere in there, and were within 4 games of that final wild card spot, as close as they could get to it. Actually, I think they got to 3.5 games at one point, but they couldn't put it together enough. That's fine. They got close. And then you had the Cincinnati Reds. Terry Francona, his first year with the Reds, and that man is magic. He did the same thing in Cleveland. He, of course, did it in Boston. And, I mean, Cincinnati just got hot. They just started putting it together with their pitching and their hitting especially. And they tied the New York Mets. They tied the New York Mets as they both headed into this final weekend of the season. Final weekend of the season. And, oh boy, actually, they were 1 game behind the New York Mets heading into this. And, actually, no, they were tied. So at this point, the New York Mets, they were tied. The Reds faced the Milwaukee Brewers as their final opponent of the season on the road in Milwaukee. The New York Mets were on the road against the Marlins. Okay, so the Milwaukee Brewers had already locked up the best record in the National League. They were the number 1 seed, and so they had nothing to play for. So they could rest their starters, and they did. They did in this series against the Cincinnati Reds. We're going to put it together there. And the Reds won the first game of that weekend series. The New York Mets playing against the Marlins actually had their number earlier in the month, head into Miami, and there's a long history to this because I, as Marlins historian, and this is the part where Charles would say, follow him on Twitter. Let's see, follow Charles at Charles the True, at Dr. Holmes for Andrew, at FJOJR for me. If you're, I don't even use that one personally, so you just follow me on my other stuff. Marlins history at Marlins history, at FLA Cats history for Panthers history, at Dolphins history, and now at MIA Heat history, as I made a Miami Heat one as well, because I could take all of them, and I'm just going to take the domains now while I still can, on Twitter at least. So, here we go. The Marlins and the Mets. So the Marlins have been here before, about 19 or so, and 18 or so years ago now. Back in 2007, the Marlins went into the final series against the New York Mets at Shea Stadium. The Mets had gone through an epic collapse as well as they were running away with the National League East at the beginning of the month and then ceded it to the Philadelphia Phillies. The Mets had won the East the season prior and went to the National League Championship Series and lost in Game 7 to the Cardinals. So it seemed like they were about to do the same thing again, but then fell apart in September in such an epic fashion it was historic. And into the final series against the Marlins. The Marlins actually took Game 1, the Mets took Game 2, and then it came down to Game 3, the final game of the season. The New York Mets had Hall of Famer Tom Glavine on the mound. The Marlins had their ace, Dontrelle Willis, on the mound, and then the Marlins proceeded to run away with the game. In the first inning, it was like 8-0. And that was it. The season was over. The Mets couldn't muster anything up, and it was over. So, that was 2007. Then the following season, in 2008, the New York Mets were trying to once again make a playoff spot. We're fighting for the final wild card spot as they were trying to jostle the Phillies for the East, but the Phillies ultimately won the East and then won the World Series later that year. The Mets, hanging on for dear life, entering the final game of the season. They needed to beat the Marlins, who were, of course, out of playoff contention by that point, too. And the Marlins, well, it was also another thing. It was Shea Stadium's final season. So the New York Mets were closing Shea Stadium to open Citi Field the next season. So there was a lot at stake to try and keep Shea Stadium alive for one more series at the very least. And the Mets pooped the bed once again as the Marlins won and shut down Shea Stadium for good. So now, oh man, I gotta add this one. And the Marlins have eliminated the Mets from the playoffs a few other times before, but in 2023, I don't know if the Marlins actually did that to them, but there was a final, actually the second to last series of the season. The Marlins fighting for one of the final two wild card spots, and final two wild card spots as they went into a midweek series against the New York Mets, the final road trip of the season at Citi Field. There was I don't know if it was a tropical storm or just like a tropical depression or something that had caused there to be a lot of rain in New York. Now, I don't know if y'all know, but here in Florida, we kind of figure out, hey, we have to keep track of these storms, and we know when they're coming and how they're coming. Ha! Okay? So, we're pretty good at predicting and be like, okay, let's prepare everything about a week or so before. Like, we know a bunch of rain's about to happen, so we should just prepare land and all that stuff, make sure there's nothing caught in the wind, and all these other things. So the New York Mets just kind of, the grounds crew, left the field just completely exposed to the elements. Okay, most grounds crew would, I don't know, cover the infield at the very least, right? because all these major league fields, outdoor stadiums have all these advanced drainage systems so they can get rid of the water real quick from the grass and they can get some games in pretty quickly. They cover the field with the turf so that the dirt isn't a mangled, muddied mess. Not the New York Mets grounds crew. They didn't leave anything, and then so they left that completely exposed to the elements, and the field was basically unplayable. So for essentially an entire night, the Marlins and Skip Shoemaker literally was trying to help the grounds crew move the turf onto the field and doing all kinds of things. And they were yelling at them. It was, I don't know, 12 a.m. and that game was not happening. It was the Marlins' final road trip of the season. They needed to get this game in. They were still fighting for a wild card spot, and every game mattered. All right. So what baseball did was the Marlins, the field was basically unplayable. It was going to be unplayable as well for the next day, and so the Marlins were going to have to fly back to New York to play a doubleheader against the Mets. After the final actually, no, this wasn't their final road trip. I mean, it was their final road trip. It was actually, yeah, they were finishing the season on the road, actually. And now that I remember. And their final road trip was supposed to be in Pittsburgh to face the Pirates. So the Marlins had to fly to Pittsburgh, and ultimately the Marlins did clinch their wild card spot in Pittsburgh. So no harm, no foul. They did have to fly back to New York to get those other games in, just for seeding purposes. And what came of the outcome? The Marlins got the second wild card spot. The Diamondbacks got the third one. The Marlins went to Philly, lost to the Phillies in the wild card round. But I remember that, and I was not very happy about the Mets and the whole situation. I actually cursed the Mets for the entirety of 2024. And I don't know if it was a complete curse, but the Mets did make the playoffs, did make it to the National League Championship Series to Game 6, but they still lost. So I'm going to count it as a win. So heading into 2025, all that's all well and good and whatever. But an opportunity for history to repeat itself appeared for the Marlins. This Marlins team, which had a surprising season, to say the least, they were supposed to lose 100 plus games and ultimately didn't. But they only lost 83 games this season, which is, I mean, it's just massive. It's just massive that they did that. And only 4 games behind those New York Mets. Final weekend of the series, the season, and the Mets are headed to Miami, and they have to win. And the Marlins are just playing well all of September. Ooh, they lined up their 3 best pitchers to take on the Mets. We had Sandy Alcantara and well, hopefully I'm hoping this isn't it, but what might have been his final start as a Marlin. You had Eury Perez, the Marlins' next ace on the line. And you had Edward Cabrera, who had a fantastic comeback season in 2025. Their 3 best pitchers, all Dominicans, all ready to take on the New York Mets. I don't even know who's pitching for the Mets. I don't care. But the Mets have the highest payroll in baseball, and the Marlins have the lowest payroll in baseball. So this is going to be fun. The Marlins take Game 1 of this series. Yes, that allowed the Cincinnati Reds to pull ahead in the National League wildcard race. Game 2, the Reds lost to the Milwaukee Brewers. The Mets beat the Marlins in Game 2. The Marlins didn't score a single run. The Mets won 5-0. Now, I saw some parallels here. I actually tweeted out, the Marlins, we got the Mets right where we want them. And the parallels are to the Florida Panthers series against the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Panthers were up 3-2 in that series against the Leafs, and they had Game 6 in Sunrise, and the Panthers lost to the Leafs in a pretty frustrating fashion. But they had Game 7 in Toronto. The Leafs, once again, looking down the barrel of losing another Game 7, to Brad Marchand, losing another series to the Florida Panthers, all within, well, the same time span of a few years. History repeating itself, and it did, because the Panthers thoroughly thrashed the Leafs on their way to the Eastern Conference Final, and ultimately the Stanley Cup. Moving forward from there, the New York Mets and the Cincinnati Reds heading into the final game of the season. Both, well, the scenario was this. The New York Mets did not have the tiebreaker against the Reds. The Reds actually won their season series against the Mets. So that leaves this. If both teams end up tied, the Reds would take the final wild card spot. If the Mets won, the Reds lost, the Mets would take it. If the Reds won in any fashion, the Mets were done regardless. Both games, the one in Milwaukee, the one in Miami, started at the same time. The Cincinnati Reds went up 2-0 against the Brewers with 2 solo home runs. The New York Mets and the Marlins jostling there, nothing, until about the mid-innings or so. The Marlins started putting up some runs, and they actually put up 4 runs. The Marlins put up 4 runs in, I think, the 4th inning or the 5th inning of this game. And suddenly the Mets are looking down at the end of the season. Now, the Milwaukee Brewers storm back to ultimately beat the Cincinnati Reds today. They were down 2-0, and then I think they won like 5-2 or 7-2 or something like that. And that was it. So the Cincinnati Reds game actually finished before the Marlins game. So the Reds are sitting in their locker room in Milwaukee, looking at the Marlins and Mets game. The Marlins are still holding on to a 4-0 lead, but the Mets have all those guys that they paid for, and it's all hands on deck for the Mets manager. Was it Carlos Mendoza, whatever he's called? And he is doing everything. He took out a starter after about 2 innings because he couldn't take the chance of the guy struggling after giving up a base runner. Ultimately, it didn't work out in the end because the Marlins scored 4 runs in the 4th inning. I don't remember, it was the 4th inning. The Mets brought in Edwin Diaz, the closer, to pitch 2 innings, and he left the Marlins scoreless just to keep the Marlins offense from going any further. The Mets offense, they had some scenarios where they could put up some runs. They even had their big boppers up there as well. They had Francisco Lindor. They had Peter Alonso, and of course, they have the $765 million man in Juan Soto. Juan Soto grounded into an inning double play in this game. He also popped up in the 8th inning when he had another opportunity to bring in some runs for the Mets. Pete Alonso out of those 3 was the only one that actually did anything, but he didn't drive any runs with all that power. And what might have been his final game as a Met. So, the New York Mets also threatened in the 8th and couldn't get any runs. And that's when the Marlins psychologically broke them at 4-0. Final inning, the Marlins end the game against the Mets with a double play. The Mets season is over. Right then and there, the Cincinnati Reds get the final wild card spot, and the Marlins have once again repeated history by eliminating the New York Mets from playoffs on the final day of the season. And boy, am I happy about it. Oh, Charles in the group chat. Oh, he was happy. Juan Soto left disappointed. The other New York team left disappointed. And so, here we are. The final day of Major League Baseball season, it actually did come down to the wire for at least one spot. I think Major League Baseball really liked that. Now, of course, the beginning of all this was the Tampa Bay Rays and the St. Louis Cardinals getting into the playoffs in 2011 on the final day of the season in wild fashion. And so Major League Baseball then created the wild card round as a result of that, with the one game playoff, actually. So the wild card game, as they called it. And then that ultimately spun into the wild card round, which was came out of COVID, actually, and then now we have the system we have today with more playoff teams, and it just being a little more exciting. This is the reason that they did this, because yeah, the wild card game was exciting in that sense, but that's between two teams. Where this season you could see why this expanded playoff system with six teams getting in. You had a ton of teams that were still in it, including the Marlins, heading into the final week of the season. And that just makes things better. The Marlins sold out this final weekend of the season. They would have been eliminated, but and of course these Mets fans were here, but I mean the Marlins, because of the way they played, they found a way to get people to notice them, and then I'm hoping that they could look the lowest payroll in baseball. They got to spend some money next season. They got to get some guys, okay, or they got to sign some of these young guys to some long-term contracts and be like, you guys are the real deal. Let's do it. So it's time. It's time. But yeah, this. I mean, so many teams were in it towards the end. I mean, the National League had like St. Louis and Miami, San Francisco, Arizona. These teams didn't make it in, but they were still in it. And the American League was a little more cut off. There was a distinct jump from those teams, but I mean, you saw how month to month the Cleveland Guardians were not even close, nowhere near, and then they just wrapped it up completely. The Royals kind of hung in there for a bit as well, right? The Texas Rangers too. So it brings a little something there, and it's a great example of, well, look what happens when you have more spots and these teams kind of go for a little bit more. Look at what Cleveland did. Okay, I mean, there's a bunch of examples of teams having monster months to just finish out a season and then go from there.